Good evening, friends. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. We are recording this, so if there's anybody that you want to see it later, we will get it posted on the website. It's nice to see we have friends from Charlotte and Greensboro and Marion and all over the conference, so that's exciting. My name is Kim Ingram, and I am the Director of Ministerial Services and the Conference Secretary for the annual conference, and I essentially am just hosting the conversation tonight. I'll introduce you to our experts in a few minutes. But I want to start with a quote from Angela Johnson, who is the Director of Sharing at Rooted Good. And she says, when people of faith step beyond the walls of their worship spaces to connect with others, they help build stronger faith, deeper relationships, and a more just and compassionate society. The article where she's quoted focuses on research that reveals that community engagement produces benefits at multiple levels. It begins with individuals, strengthens congregations, and ultimately contributes to a healthier society. And I'm going to guess you're here tonight because you're interested in learning more about some piece of that. The outcomes point directly to the benefits that can be gained through partnerships between churches and nonprofits. We don't have to invent the wheel, so to speak, and that's good news. So I do want to introduce you to our guests tonight. Joining me for the webinar are Reverend Russ Pierce. And Russ is a Western North Carolina Conference clergy member and the Executive Director of Housing for New Hope in Durham. Now, a fun fact about Russ is he leads a certificate program at Duke Divinity School in nonprofit management. We're trying to figure out how we can get some of his wisdom beyond this webinar tonight around that. And then also want to introduce Brianna Goodwin, who is the Executive Director of the Robeson County Church and Community Center. What she doesn't know is my fun fact about her when I Googled is that she knows it, she just doesn't know I know it, is that she was featured in the Fayetteville Observer as 40 under 40. Like that was a wish list. Like, wow, how do you get to be 40 under 40? Like that's highlighting a leader in the community. And I guess maybe one day I'll be 100 under 100 or something, but I thought that was impressive. So we're glad to have both of you, and we'll hear from you in a minute. But first, let us pray together. Most gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the churches who care about their communities. We give you thanks for the disciples who seek to share God's love and care. We give thanks for the nonprofits who seek to support the health, basic needs, equality, and justice for all humans. And we give you thanks for Jesus, who modeled healing and feeding and advocating and supporting. We pray for our time together that it would be fruitful. In the name of Christ, amen. I want to give you an idea of where we're going tonight and what you can expect. So Russ will begin with a presentation to cover some of the nuts and bolts and get us thinking about congregations and nonprofit partnerships. And then Bree will join us as we have conversation about the practical application and engagement. There will be time for questions and input, but at any point, you're welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll be watching it as we go along and try to incorporate the questions into our conversation. And finally, as I mentioned, we are recording it. We'll post it on the conference website along with Russ's PowerPoint so that you're able to reference it and share it with others as you would like to. So again, we're glad you're here. Russ, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kim. And I think if I've done this correctly, you all can see a PowerPoint about now. Can you see? So perfect. Okay. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm one of those words on paper people when it comes to PowerPoints. There will be no pictures. So I'm just saying in advance, it is not pretty. It is functional, but it's a delight to be with you, and really excited to have this conversation. Partly because I've had the unusual opportunity to serve in congregations, to serve in nonprofits, and also serve in the funder that connects those things at times. So I've been able to be at most of the places around the table on this work for a long time. And because of that role and that work over the years, I've been able to work with a lot of partners and glean a lot from their experience that I hope we can share tonight, and learn from together as we're in conversation, especially toward the end of our evening. So we want to start with just a little about why would we consider a partnership? Part of this comes from a very basic place of we can't do everything, and we're not necessarily meant to do everything. God continues to call many organizations to do extraordinary work in our communities, extraordinarily important work in our communities and around the globe. And sometimes our call is just to figure out how we can be good partners with them, learn from them, and support their work. Um, we also come into this many times wanting to deepen our relationships in our community and in communities across the world. And as we talk about different kind of partnerships tonight, you'll see how one of the pieces there is increasing levels of deep relationships. Obviously, we want to support work in many cases that's already happening in the community. I think one of the things we often miss is that we joke about this in one of the classes I teach at Duke that God has not necessarily been waiting for us to get on board with responding to needs in our community. Oftentimes things have been raised up, and now our role is to strengthen them. There are times when we need to step in and create something new, but oftentimes partnering is really our best option. We also, many times, the work that we want to do moves into very complex social challenges. And so being able to draw on the expertise of partners is really important. And also, sometimes partnerships are about advocating for justice and joining our voices with others to move toward long-term systemic change. So when we start to move out and think through engaging our community differently and looking at partnerships, a few things we want to remember. One is to really do, I think, that deep work of prayerfully considering why and how we want to engage our
We had
community.
a bunch
Um,
of stuff.
is it about a call to serve more deeply? Is it a call sometimes to find a new way forward for our congregation if it is struggling? Whatever it is, it's important to think through that and be honest about it as we move into potential partnerships. We want to understand the community's unique assets and giftedness. For 3 or 4 years, I had the opportunity to serve as one of the Connect coach with the North Carolina Rural Center's Faith in Rural Communities program. And one of the things that was so helpful for me as a coach and in working with congregations is that asset-based community development approach, not starting from what's missing, but starting from what are the gifts and assets that are already in this community that we can build from. And the same is true for our congregation and its unique assets, its giftedness, and I would even add its call. I have often shared with folks that just as we understand individuals have particular calls to ministry and are gifted for that work, I honestly believe congregations have particular calls. I was working with a congregation a number of years ago that was thinking through how to better engage its community and go more deep in that work. And what came through over time was that what they loved to do was work on issues around food justice, serving meals that created community, being a response group whenever there was a disaster, and it was always around food, creating food pantries, creating community gardens. Like there was just this very clear, if it was about food, that seemed to be something that they got energized about. And I think that begins to reflect call. And that's something important for us to think about and reflect on as we look at this work. So if we're going into a partnership, the assumption is that we are all going to be bringing something to that partnership. So what do congregations bring? We often bring deep relational networks. I remember a number of years ago when I was working at UMCOR, this was when one of the seasons when a number of hurricanes went through Puerto Rico, and both the Clinton Global Initiative and the Gates Foundation, another group, came to us because they were amazed and they were like, how are you able to move things so quickly in Puerto Rico on the ground? Well, the fact was that the Methodist Church in Puerto Rico had an extraordinary presence in each of the communities where it had been planted and where it was serving. And so we were able to deploy resources really quickly because they already had those relationships. We also, as congregations, bring volunteers and a deep sense, if we've been formed in the faith, of compassion. And so we're going to interact with folks in different ways than may happen with just volunteers that are not coming from our background. Many years ago, I served in the refugee camps in Rwanda and was there more as an observer than a server, to be quite honest. One of the things that the refugees kept sharing with us was that they appreciated working with the faith-rooted organizations because even when the staff weren't necessarily from that faith, they realized that there was a different sense of compassion and love that was evidenced through that whole organization in the way that they were engaged and the way they were treated. Many times we bring physical spaces and gathering places, particularly in rural areas and in some urban areas. We may be the only place that has enough space to gather, and that's an asset to be shared. We often have had a long-term presence in the community, and whether we exercise it or not on a regular basis, others assume that as the church, we have a moral voice and a justice perspective that can be activated. So, what do nonprofits bring? Oftentimes, they have professional expertise and trained staff in particular areas that we want to work in. One example I give is that here at Housing for New Hope, we work with supportive housing for folks that are exiting long-term homelessness. So we don't do shelter, which is what folks often think of. That's an important thing that our partners do. But we're that long haul partner that's going to work with people for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years as they come out of working through many of their challenges around mental health and substance use disorder and long-term homelessness. We've got folks on staff that have a lot of experience and training in how to work with individuals that are on that kind of a journey. It's a little different than you often see in congregations. And so we're able to partner with a lot of communities of faith to extend their work in ways that have a greater impact on the individuals that are being served. Oftentimes, nonprofits have program infrastructure that's pretty complex and able to respond to a variety of needs. Case management, so that they're looking pretty comprehensively at the needs that individuals have. It may not just be about food or about finances or about housing, but the whole picture of what it takes for someone to move toward long-term stability. They've often been immersed in this work enough to see all the different social issues and how they work together, and it's sometimes work against each other when you're trying to help people. Depending on their size and complexity, they may know how to deal with compliance issues that come with grants that maybe in a congregation we're not used to having to deal with, and often have an ability to scale services that are established. So each partner is bringing very different pieces. So as we start discerning actual partnerships, just a few highlights of things to think about. One is to think through mission alignment. Does the organization serve people in ways that are consistent with our values? Do they engage people in ways that are compassionate, deeply respectful, and supportive of their own long-term needs and wants and desires? We want to think about trust and reputation because it is important to remember that just as there are many sizes of churches and many levels of complexity in churches, the same is true for nonprofits. And it isn't unusual sometimes for a nonprofit to have a lot of respect. I'm noticing this with an organization here in the Triangle. There's a lot of respect from its donors, but the folks that handle compliance with them and the individuals that are being served don't have the same experience. There's a disconnect between kind of the broader reputation and the experience for those who are participants. So sussing out a little bit, is the organization respected by those it serves? Asking, how do they get client and participant feedback? What were the last few things that they learned from that feedback that helped them grow and learn and adjust as an organization? Is an important learning piece just to kind of dig in a little bit. Impact, are they addressing root causes or just symptoms? Are we kind of going upriver to figure out what's going on or just concentrating on the challenges, that are right in front of us? And then role clarity. What exactly is the congregation being asked to do? We always want to be really clear what our gifts and skills are and what we can contribute in the partnership, and honestly, what we can't. And then also, is this a one-time activity or an ongoing commitment? And part of that comes from, I think a lot of times we root our work in that beautiful passage you see there on your screen from Matthew 25. And I often share with folks that this is such a beautiful, wonderful place to start. But I've realized over time that you could preach Matthew 25, 35 to 37 on a Sunday morning, And with probably one exception, you could check off all those items by the end of the day. I think the one that you can't nowadays is you're probably not going to get clearance because of the background checks required to get into a prison and visit somebody on a Sunday afternoon. That is not going to happen. But the rest of the stuff you really can, and it's important work. But I find it also very, very helpful for us to root in Jesus's words from Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That, I think, gives us a very long haul view of the work. And when we really start to dig into some of the challenges that folks face and the systemic issues
Okay.
that they are up against, those are
My call.
long-term things that we have to be working on alongside many times those immediate needs that we're trying to address. So, three kinds of partnerships. First is transactional. Let me say, this is a helpful word. Please do not misread the use of transactional as something negative. This is an important part of the work that happens in many places. We think of disasters when folks immediately move into volunteering opportunities, making gifts of cleaning buckets, making all kinds of things, making immediate gifts. These transactional partnerships are vitally important, particularly in crisis situations, but they are also for many congregations a very important place to get started. You can probably think of these from your congregation: giving to the food pantry, having angel trees around Christmas time, um, and maybe as a congregation making gifts to specific organizations to undergird their work. It's a great starting place, and in many cases, it becomes a sustaining piece. As an organization where I serve now, we were actually founded by Presbyterians. We are interestingly not faith-based because we serve as our community's lead implementer for a lot of HUD-funded homeless services. And 30 plus years ago, when we were founded, if you were faith-based, you could not access those resources. So we were never officially and still are not officially faith-based. And yet that is the main driver for so many of our staff. But a lot of the congregations that helped found us are still making 5 and 6 figure gifts to us every year that are really critical. So it's not downplaying those kinds of gifts. It's just noting that for many, in many cases, that's an important starting place, but maybe not where we always just want to be. There's also programmatic partnerships. So we want to increase our impact in the community. Um, One of the interesting things is thinking through, are there nonprofits that are trying to extend their reach and work into the community where we are based that just need space and need a great place to partner? Hosting a food pantry run by a nonprofit can be a critical piece. There are many organizations that work with mental health that need places to do counseling, especially in rural areas or in some urban areas. Those kind of partnerships are really critical extensions of our work and of their work. We can also provide space for reentry and recovery programs, as so many of our churches do, that create a long-term sustainable place for their presence and their ministry. We can also at times come together collectively to support referral pathways to housing and support services. That sounds very technical now that I look at that again. But many years ago when I served in Asheville, one of the real gifts of Asheville was that we had an organization called ABCCM, and more than 200 churches supported them. And so rather than individuals who are experiencing homelessness or a crisis having to, in a sense, shop from church to church and be re-traumatized by having to continue to share their experience over and over and over, folks could go to one place, and more than 200 churches were providing support that could be accessed and tracked very centrally. So that becomes another way that, yes, it was a giving of money, but it was an ongoing engagement that was really transformational and really quite impactful for a lot of the folks there in the community. Then there are strategic partnerships where we're working to advance long-term systems change. Um, Congregations can have an extraordinary impact supporting community-wide advocacy programs and campaigns. A couple of us were talking earlier before we got on the call about our experience with working with county commissioners and with city councils. And I will say one of the things that will move discussions is when churches show up and raise concerns around particular issues. So I'll give an example that's interesting from here in Durham. Um, in North Carolina, despite the fact that we have a pretty horrendous affordable housing crisis across the state, local municipalities, by the action of the state legislature, cannot require affordable housing to be in developments. Can't do it. However, if a city or county municipality is investing in a project or owns land that is made available for a project, they can require anything they want. So a group of congregations here in Durham, including United Methodist congregations, got together and over a sustained number of years pushed and pushed and pushed for both the city and county to make some of their land that was downtown available for affordable housing development. And they are in the process of bringing on 300 or 400 units that are on land that used to just be sitting there as parking lots that the city and the county owns some, city owns some. But it was largely congregations who pushed to make that kind of thing happen. Another piece that can be a long-term strategic piece is churches are starting to make their land available, sometimes for affordable housing development. I've seen some places where it's for mental health resource centers or childcare centers. We have one here that actually is dedicated to supporting people with very limited income because that is such a need. So it is a mission of the congregation versus in some cases where churches may do it as a way to use space and garner income. So they've taken a very different approach to that. So there are long-term possibilities for us, and especially in a season where we are seeing so many of the benefits like SNAP that are I'll say under pressure tonight, but under severe distress is probably where we're headed. Congregations speaking up, city, county, school board meetings, legislature can be a really critical thing for us to consider doing, even if that's not something we've historically done. So a few challenges, regardless of which kind of partnership you're looking at to highlight. So one is unclear expectations. We see this sometimes with volunteers. They are unsure of what in the world they are supposed to be doing. The same can be true for partnerships. So important to think through when you're partnering with a group, again, making sure there's clarity around what you're bringing to the table, what they're bringing to the table, and even depending on how deep that partnership is, how you're going to handle challenges. Another can be mission drift. Again, I do believe congregations have a sense of call. At the same time, I think sometimes we can have one individual get very excited about their passion, and the congregation can kind of go that direction without necessarily doing the discerning work to make sure it's their collective passion. That can be true for pastors or individuals in the congregation. So I think it's important to be very careful about mission drift away from the congregation's call or trying to do things that are just beyond the place that where we are at this moment. We laugh sometimes that I think sometimes we feel like we should, as pastors, for those of us that are pastors, be able to go in a congregation. They should just immediately go in the direction that we think they need to go, especially when it comes to this kind of work. And I kind of compare it to praying. People are not going to turn into mystics overnight. Um, there's a journey there. There's deeper prayer and a whole panoply of spiritual formation possibilities there that may get someone to that point. I think the same is true of this work. Sometimes we need to figure out, as running goes, how to do the 5K before we sign up to do a marathon. Let's do the thing that's the next best step as we grow and build this out for the long term. We also want to look at power imbalances. Churches can unintentionally create dependency with individuals, but there can also be power imbalances depending on the size of the nonprofit, the size of the church, and how those relationships work. We can also have the issue, and this sometimes comes when one individual gets excited and everyone kind of gets excited behind them without discerning if it's everyone's vision together. Um, Short-term enthusiasm can flare fast and die just as fast. Um, so making sure that partnerships are built within the community and the community of the congregation, so that when the champion leaves, especially if that's a pastor or staff person, that partnership can continue. And then finally, just communication breakdown. Just as we can have happen in the life of a congregation, partnering with a nonprofit takes extra work. It takes a lot of contact and connections between leadership in the congregation, leadership in the organization, to make sure that it's moving forward well. So finally, just in quick review, as you're thinking about potential partnerships, important to learn about community needs, what's going on out there, understanding who the trusted nonprofit partners are in that work. It's important to start small and build those relationships, to be clear on expectations, so that we can build the long-term relationships that will help really move the needle over time. I love the fact that I serve in a place that has partners that have been with us for 30 years and partners that have been with us for 3, because each of them brings different gifts, and each of them is helping us do pretty extraordinary long-term work after people have been through that immediate crisis. And I think each of us as individuals and as in our congregations have that opportunity to build those kind of partnerships over the long haul. So I'm going to stop there and take this back off screen and turn back over to Kim.
Can't decide if I can spotlight me. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So thank you very much for that, Russ. And while it's on the top of your head, if you have any questions specific to anything Russ said, why don't you go ahead and put them in the chat so that we can be sure to cover them and think about them in the next 30 minutes while we're still together. But I want to introduce you all, as I did, but to turn it over for a minute to Bree. Bree runs a nonprofit and has had a lot of experience in connecting nonprofit and church work. Bree, I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about your organization and your experience in connecting churches and nonprofits.
Yes, thank you, everyone who took out their time. I always say time is our most valuable resource, so it just means a lot to me to have you all here this evening with us to hear about these integral partnerships. And thank you to Russ for such a thorough presentation that covered all the ins and outs and nuances of church nonprofit partnerships. I really enjoyed really reflecting on things that I think I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks, put so in such a beautiful fashion. But I have the unique privilege of being the executive director, of course, of the Robeson County Church and Community Center. Our location is in the name. Our headquarters is in Lumberton, North Carolina. It's on the way to the beach. It's probably a place you've driven through if you haven't had a chance to visit, but a very unique place, a very racially diverse place that makes our work even more challenging in certain ways. And we were founded in 1969, actually through the conference, through the Bishop's Fund for Reconciliation, because we were working on integration and voting rights and things along those lines as we were formed. So we really are the most malleable organization that I've ever known. We really respond to the moment. And so because we respond to the moment, our work has spanned from literacy to everything from gardening to workforce development, to our current work, which is work with food scarcity, a lot of advocacy around the unsheltered population and affordable housing. So really along those same lines, but also just responding to, what happens in that moment, like the pause in the SNAP benefits that we had in the fall with the government shutdown, other things like, of course, natural disasters, which no one in North Carolina, I think, is immune to at this point. So, we've all been touched by situations like that. So that's what I would say that I'm the most proud of, is that we've never stagnated or said we're going to keep doing things the way we've done them, just because we've done them that way. And it just speaks to how important it is to be informed by the community in which you serve, knowing the community, understanding the community. So that is, how we orient our work. And yeah, just really excited to have the conversation and see what questions folks may have for us.
Thank you so much. So, different churches have different contexts, right? Some congregations may have a history of community outreach, of community service, of engagement in a variety of ways in their communities. Some may just be looking for how do we get our, kind of get things started. I wondered, and Bree, I'll let you start with this, and then Russ can add. What's a reasonable place for a church to start, whether it's newly getting engaged in their community or wanting to think about what need they might meet and what assets they bring and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Well, as it was mentioned in the presentation, it's very important to know your community. Each community has different needs. And so once you really are able to assess maybe what two or three of the community needs are, for example, if there's a lot of needs in public education, for one, where they need volunteers in the schools or they need chaperones on field trips. I mean, that's just one example that, education and nonprofit partners may work with. It's about identifying those one or two things that church may want to address. If it's food scarcity, starting with something small, like collecting food, contacting that nonprofit that runs the food pantry, asking what types of foods. Some nonprofits are equipped with refrigeration and freezers. We're very fortunate to have that level of infrastructure. Some can only accept shelf-stable items. So it's about identifying, what it is the community needs, who's meeting that need, and the exact way that church can start to address it.
Thanks, Russ. Is there anything you would add to that?
I think of a congregation I served a number of years ago that was well resourced, I'll put it that way. And it was interesting because if you really look at their history over about 40 years, they were probably one of the first congregations to have overseas mission trips. And so, like, they did work in South Africa. Then they eventually did work in Puerto Rico. And then they kind of like hopscotched over themselves to the west and started doing work in Appalachia. And then they started doing disaster work in North Carolina, literally over like 30 or 40 years. It was really kind of fascinating. Then they helped build a center, child care center in the community, like $1 million investment, like a really big investment across town. And there finally came a point where it would have been great if they'd gotten there sooner, but they started to really look at the community that was around them. Because if they went out the front door, literally, there was a country club community that was largely there where they all lived. And, quite literally out the side door, there were about 8,000 people that were in like two or three of the lowest economic categories federally that you can imagine, and one of the like 10 most struggling schools in the state. And so sometimes like I think it's love it when you just talk about take the next best step. Like they just really weren't at a point that they could really originally do the work right outside the door. They had to like learn over time about working with other folks that were very different from them. And then they finally got to the point they really were beautifully engaged there in their actual community. So I think part of it's really like it was baffling that to me that it took 40 years to get to like 4 blocks away, but it was the journey that they took. And so I think sometimes it's just really discerning and understanding where that congregation is in its life and what the next stretch is for them in terms of their engagement in the community.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things that I kind of think is really important in any kind of work that the church brings to it that might be different than a Rotary Club or a Civic Club, because both groups might have volunteers, they might have access to some money. There are some similarities, but I think our theological understanding of everyone being made in the image of Christ and our call to serve, and you offered scriptures that underpin that or support that. And also, I think it's about relationship, and that we are really called to relationship and um, not just to the transactional things. At the point we can develop the relationships and help somebody experience the love of God through us. So I wonder if you might talk about what that looks like with a nonprofit. Really two things. One is, are there limitations or hesitations because we are religious very often And maybe that's only around the funding piece, and the nonprofits can often access that. But the other is there anything to think about from a congregation's perspective around relationships and how you begin to move in that direction with whatever you might already be doing or be thinking about doing? Okay, Russ, you go first, and then we'll see what Bree will add.
You know, we're in an interesting period where there's a lot more openness to it, and I do think that is good. I will say, like, we have lots of federal like millions of dollars in federal contracts, and there are limitations on like proselytizing with anything related to that funding. However, that doesn't mean congregations can't come in, and on some of our campuses, they offer worship, they offer meals where they connect, small group studies. So um, all of that can happen. And I think oftentimes we can forget, the refugee settlement system, right? Which is under a lot of stress right now. When the State Department set up its programs in the 60s, they came and got info from two groups, UMCOR and Church World Service, which are both important partners of the United Methodist Church, obviously, and basically replicated our systems for settling people because the research shows folks will be more successful when they settle here as refugees if a community of faith is part of that process. And so I think there can be nonprofits that are like absolutely not willing to engage, and you can be in context. There's a little bit of that flavor here in Durham. There was a little bit of that when I lived in Asheville, where you have to be a little more careful with your government engagement if you're from a faith community. But I think we can really lean in many times to that relational nature, that community focused nature, is a real gift that we bring to the partnerships as churches.
Bree, does anything else come to your mind?
Well, something I say almost always when I have the opportunity to speak to relationships is relationships move at the speed of trust. And so, speaking about the church that went from international to, maybe within the country to within the state to down the street, that the folks across the street, so to speak, may have thought, why now? Why us? Why have you never had concern for us in the past? And so that type of breakdown of trust or that suspicion can exist sometimes when you're introducing a congregation into a population that maybe has only been served by nonprofits or other organizations or maybe, individuals. And so I do believe that there is a level of humility that we have to have the posture of when we enter those situations and know that there could be suspicion, and that it is worth building that trust. It is worth the investment of trust building and understanding that it can take time and showing up consistently, and just showing again, the love of Christ in a sincere way. And we can't always start with being as overt about what has compelled us to do this. We have to show it through our actions, and then someone has a much greater openness to hearing what it is that compels us to do that work. So there's a certain way to enter those types of relationships, and I believe that I have the kind of fortunate situation of our faith bases in our name, so people know what they're getting when we enter a relationship, and so we never really have to explain that or anything. But sometimes we do still have to build trust and break down some stereotypes and sometimes even negative experiences that people have had, and we've just come with a real willingness to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
I
really
will say, Bree,
helpful.
that is such a good point because Kim, I remember years ago I served culturally as pastor of an historically African American congregation, and they were in the process trying to think through revitalization. And I remember going to conference leadership someone that was there to help resource us. And what became clear was the congregation itself, it was a very high resource, highly educated congregation that had created, I think the way to put it is a lot of barriers within their own community over the years. And I remember the conference staff person who was helping me just saying, well, good luck with that. And then kind of backing up and unpacking it that the relationship building and that suspicion of why are you interested in us suddenly now? Is it because you're in distress? Are you just trying to stay open and just being honest about, again, why you want to do that work? but being very reflective on you may be the new pastoral leader there, but that congregation may have 80 to 100 years of history of how they've interacted with the neighborhood. And you've kind of got to start from that place. It can be overcome, but you do have to think through how you're going to start from that. I'm glad you said that, Bree.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think the relationships can be transformational for the people in the congregation when we're open to um, the relationship and getting to know someone that might be different than we are, but that have really valuable and rich experiences. So I just think that's an important part of it. Bree, we talked a little bit when we were preparing for tonight about service, about community partnerships, about that being something that young people are interested in, young adults, and that it could be a way for churches to connect with young adults, whether it's in their communities or maybe it's a local campus ministry, college ministry, something, just a way that it could be a connection between a church, some kind of group of young adults, and a nonprofit. And I loved just talking to you about kind of your experience with young people and how you've captured that. So I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I will say when I'm speaking with my generation, millennials and on down, when they are church shopping, so to speak, and visiting, one of the first questions they're going to have is how is the church involved in the community, or what do they do to give back? Because it's going to be so important to my generation. I think the generations that are coming behind me to understand, okay, how are my tithes being used, and how is my time and energy, being used? Because we have a real interest in changing the world around us and improving the lives of the people who are suffering at this time. So when we bear witness to congregations that are actively involved in the community, partnering with nonprofits, meeting the needs, whether that be through food services, whether that's serving the unsheltered, whether that's working in the public education system. Even if I see a church participating this week in teacher appreciation, that means a lot because people are paying attention in that congregation, to what's happening and supporting those who we need to be supporting right now who have been marginalized in any way. So I will say for churches that are interested in building their congregations and growing their congregations with, folks who are in that demographic of newly married or having young families, then that is a great way to be the type of church that younger folks would want to be a part of. And I think they would be willing to also volunteer in that capacity as well to help build those types of auxiliary church services.
So I'm going to put Heather on the spot. Heather didn't come to this webinar to have to participate, but I can't. I have to acknowledge that she's here, and I'm going to actually invite her to participate in my next question. And after that one, I think we'll open it up to anybody else that might have some questions. Heather is a clergy member of Western North Carolina, and she's a director of faith in rural communities at the NC Rural Center. And my next question is around rural churches. And Russ, you referenced this in your presentation at the beginning, but sometimes it feels harder for rural churches because, in an urban area, a lot of times there are a lot of nonprofits and it may be just overwhelming to figure out which one and where and what. But in rural areas, sometimes it can feel more challenging because it may be harder to find the nonprofits or to find the partners. And so I wonder what kind of insight or input you would give to rural churches in taking steps in partnering with nonprofits. Heather, are you willing to take that one on, or should we make Russ go first and then we come back to you?
Heather.
Thanks, Kim. I appreciate you asking that question because I think it's a very important question. If you sit down in the middle of Charlotte, like there's nonprofits everywhere you look, but in a lot of rural areas, the church is the nonprofit. The church is the one that's doing the food pantry. There's still opportunities to connect to nonprofits. I'm working with a church in a very small town, and Bree's nonprofit is helping to resource them so they can supply a mobile food pantry. I have connected with the YMCA, and they're very interested in offering services in communities that don't have a YMCA. So they want to send their folks out and do exercise classes or nutrition classes in rural areas. The same with the AARP. They give a lot of grants in urban areas and they're interested in connecting in rural areas. So there are resources there, but you have to work a little bit harder and you depend more on relationships than you may have to do in a rural area.
So you want to give a plug for your organization while you have the chance?
Yes, and a shout out. Members of the First Marian Connect Church are here, so shout out to that team. I work for the North Carolina Rural Center, so we work with rural churches all across both conferences, the Western North Carolina and the North Carolina conferences. And we help churches to understand what are their gifts that God has already given them, to understand what are the needs in the community, and to build a ministry in the intersection of the gifts and the needs. We are able to offer a grant to sort of kickstart a new ministry. So the program is called Connect Church. Any church is welcome to apply, though we do focus on rural churches. And we'll open up our application in July. So you're welcome to reach out to me, but also we'll release that information through the conference newsletter. So you'll also see when the Connect Church application opens. Thank you, Kim. Thanks for letting me do a plug.
Thanks for being willing to spontaneously join our conversation. I'll take you off of the spotlight now, but feel free to chime back in if you want to. Bree, I wanted to follow up with what you're talking about with rural because Robeson County is not, there are some parts that are more populated and some parts that are not. And Heather mentioned a partnership that y'all were working on. Do you want to say anything else about kind of how rural areas might connect into nonprofits and that kind of work?
Sure. Well, I spend a lot of time driving. To be transparent, Robeson County is the largest county in the state of North Carolina by land. And so it is just a necessary part of partnerships that you have to be willing to go there. It was one of the very first lessons that I got when I started working at the center. And I didn't begin as executive director. I worked into that position. So thankfully I had some time to, kind of get my feet planted before I was in charge of the organization. But when I would get feedback from the clients, from the folks that we serve, they would say, oh, that's just for Lumberton, which is, of course, where we're housed, and that's where the county seat is. And so there was kind of this perception that we didn't care. We didn't have regard for those who lived in those rural areas. And so it has taken years of not just visiting sometimes, but showing up in those places. And some of them are a 30-minute drive. Orem, which is where Bethesda is located, the church that Heather's referencing, it's about a 25-minute drive from our office one way. And so that's not extremely long for someone who's accustomed to commuting. But, there are times that I've had meetings in two of our different rural areas in one day. And, that's 2 hours of driving just within the county. But you have to be willing. You have to be willing to go to people. And that's because at the income level of our county, which is a federally designated persistent poverty county, there are transportation barriers. So even if you have programs, they cannot always come to you. You have to rethink your programming and make it available to them. And so that's where you see some of our work, like our mobile food pantry. It goes out every Thursday of the month to a different community. We've just added a Tuesday because we ran out of Thursdays. That's where you see us hosting when we have our annual banquet where we bring in all of our funders and our board members. We move it around the county, so we don't always host it in the same place. And so we've had to be extremely deliberate about how we go about things so that we are more inclusive of the rural areas. But it takes some real concerted effort and some willingness to get in a car and spend some time driving.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to put in the chat just a link to the grants page on the Western North Carolina Conference. We did 2 webinars around grants. Sebastian Byers is a member of our team and an expert in grants. And so he has hosted 2 different grant webinars that are posted there. And if you don't connect to that link, you can always go to the conference webpage and just search grants and you'll find the page. But as we're talking about partnerships and nonprofits, and Heather mentioned grants, I thought it would be helpful just to know where we are resourcing that. as congregations might want, even through the partnerships, to apply for grants to help with the partners. So wanted to put that there. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd really love to hear anybody that has joined us. If you want to talk about, and you don't have to, but we'd love to hear from you why you joined us, what your interest is, what your questions might be, or any ways that Bree or Russ could help resource you tonight while you have direct access to them. Yeah, Carolyn, I thought I could tell you were trying to get off mute. Go ahead, Carolyn.
No, that's okay. No, Ardmore United Methodist Church in Winston-Salem, and it was just timely because I just left our mission engagement meeting, and our clergy, Kelly Carpenter, has really nudged us to identify with a nonprofit of which it's not just monetary contributions, but it is actual relationships. And that concept, so it was just timely. So I left that meeting to join this one because I thought, we could gather. But I loved that statement of relate. Now I may misquoting it, Bree, but relationships operate at the speed of trust. I thought that was brilliant. And that means personal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he was wanting us to focus on one nonprofit and all the resources going there. And I said, no, you can't do that, because there are too many nonprofits who need this, that see these monetary contributions as sustaining. And to drop one big lump sum of money in one, but you don't do it the next year, that just takes, that's off the radar screen. So, but it's the people involvement. It's being outside the walls of the church. Yes, we have the food pantry and the clothing closet. We have that ministry going on every third Thursday, and it's huge. We probably have 80 to 90 families that are participating in that. But it's getting outside the walls of the church. And so looking at, and our congregation is very senior in age. And we tend to look at what the younger folks might be interested in, but that's not where we're tapping the interest. And of course, theirs would be, later in the day, because they're professionals and they've got work schedules. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of seniors who have the time in the middle of the day, when some of these are really in need of that. So it was a timely conversation based on being nudged outside the church walls.
Well, we're glad you joined us. Yeah, Bree, please talk to us.
Yeah, if I could just mention quickly, thank you for the wisdom of not just swiping the financial resource away from those who you would pledge financial resources to, especially for smaller nonprofits. That can be extremely destabilizing. And sometimes we feel like we did something wrong or dissatisfied the donor if something is taken quickly. What I will say, there is nothing wrong with reassessing your alignment, however, over time. And if it is time for you all to reassess your alignment, if money is going several different places and not all of those places are truly aligned with what it is that you aim to do at that time, notifying them, well in advance, hey, this is going to be our final year for the foreseeable future. Due to alignment, we're going to be supporting organizations that do these types of things. And then what you would be able to do is actually build relationships with those ones that you dwindled down to, but not just kind of knee-jerk swiping the funding. Was a wonderful recommendation on your part. And I thank you on behalf of a nonprofit that is kind of built up to being a larger nonprofit, because we would have really struggled with something like that 5 years ago. So thank you for your grace in that.
Yeah, I would second that. I feel like I keep running into male pastors in their 50s that are new to their appointments who keep doing this across not just Methodists, but here too. And I feel like they've all read some book that I just haven't run into yet. If I see it too much, I figure somebody's read a book or a blog or heard a podcast. I do think I agree. There's a point of discernment about where to engage and evaluating that on a regular basis, but um, there oftentimes are long-term relationships and partnerships. I know I used to serve in the Redbird Mission Conference. It's got a new name now, but it's been a long time.
Central Appalachian Missionary Conference.
Thank you. Thank you. And that was a period when a lot of churches were going from doing 20 to 4. And I remember it was just like everyone was on pins and needles for like 2 years because it just seemed like there was this movement, everyone was going to cut back to less. And it really was challenging and it affected some of the ministries because there wasn't a time horizon that allowed them to really adjust. And in many cases, these were 30, 40, 50, 60-year relationships. So I think that's wise. And I think your point too of thinking through different times and opportunities based on people's ages and availability. I know we led street outreach here for more than 20 years, and so we would often get calls from churches that their young people wanted to go out and do street outreach. It was oftentimes tied to then going out to pubs and stuff after. But they were trying to fill a real, yeah, it really was. When I started asking questions about where they were going, it's like, oh, this is a pub outing with a street outreach stop. Um, but that was where they were starting, and it led to more later. But it was looking at very different times on weekends or evenings, and it was bringing new people in because they were providing flexible opportunities. So I think you're on to something there, Carol.
Is there anybody else that wants to share with us your interest or ask a question? Well, then Bree and Russ, I think we'll finish up with a word from each of you, if you will. Just what is a blessing or a word of wisdom that you would give to the congregations as they begin to either begin to or continue thinking about partnerships with nonprofits? Bree, why don't you go first, and then Russ, you can bring us home.
Well, I'll be transparent. This is not scripture, but it challenges our framework and our thinking during times that are very uncertain. And so it's a quote that I really love. If we have the ability to worry, we have the ability to imagine. And so that really is all that worry is imagining a negative outcome. And so if we have the ability to worry, we have the ability to dream of every positive outcome and every good thing that could come in the future. So I just encourage you, when you find yourself worrying, to use your imagination differently.
Love that.
Yeah. And I would say never doubt, no matter the place where your congregation is on its journey and in its life, never doubt that you have gifts to bring to your community and to different kinds of partnerships because there are always, again, it's that asset-based approach. There are always gifts there that you have to offer others and that God wants to offer through you. So no matter how large or small, no matter the resources, there's always a gift there or gifts that you have to offer. And so please take the opportunity to offer those gifts, especially to our most vulnerable neighbors and the folks that partner with them.
So many thanks to Bree and to Russ for joining us and sharing their experiences and their wisdom and their learnings. I really appreciate that. Friends, Western North Carolina wants to support you in your outreach and in the ways that you connect with your communities and your neighbors. This is one resource for that, whether you've joined us live or you might watch it as a video later. But we have a mission engagement team. We have folks who do evangelism. Anyway, let us know how we can support you. And as I said, we're doing education around grants and just helping people think multiple ways around this. So, and then we have resources like the NC Rural Center and the Duke Endowment. And we are really blessed for those kind of relationships and resources. So let us know how we can help you and support you. And we especially thank you for giving us your time tonight. God's blessings be with each of you.